A critic as early as 1923 identified this group of artists as nobody's darlings. And it's those stories we really want to bring out in the exhibition, to re-establish their importance in Australian art and how they participate in developing art internationally during this time. Stories which have often been forgotten. Dangerously Modern explores the art and lives of 50 trailblazing women artists, an extraordinary group who travelled from Australia out into the world in the late 19th century and participated in the development of global modernism. And Eleanor Ritchie Harrison was one of the very first Australian women to go to Europe and study to become an artist. When we began developing this exhibition, I wanted to find works by Eleanor. I knew of her from previous research, but I'd never seen one of her paintings. So one of the things we did was really dig in and try and find surviving works. It turned out there were none in public collections, and A Winter Morning on the Coast of France, which was one of her most reviewed works in the late 1880s, early 1890s, and this was the one major surviving work that we knew of, was the one we really set ourselves to tracking down. And I'm thrilled we were able to achieve that. When we saw Eleanor's painting, it presented well, but on the other hand, the reality with any painting which hasn't been exhibited publicly for 130 years is that it had definitely had a life. In approaching conserving the work, we want to keep the history of those 130 years and to be able to bring the painting itself much closer to her vision when it was painted.
So conservation is more the holistic approach to preserving cultural and material objects.
We want the painting, both as an aesthetic piece and a historical document, to be there for future generations.
With Eleanor Ritchie Harrison's painting and other paintings that come to the gallery, often they come with a history of previous restorations. So the UV reveals that there has been several restoration campaigns in the past.
We can probably see different retouchings
Yeah.
here, and we've got some retouchings in here somewhere. Yeah, here.
And so our job is to assess whether those layers present need to be removed in order for viewers or the public to understand the work better in its original form.
These damages are not showing up in the UV because
Yeah.
we've got heavy varnish masking.
What's underneath, yeah.
And there's evidence of selective cleaning. You
Right.
see this band here.
Yeah.
And also you can see on the paint here where there's areas of abrasion and
Yes.
over cleaning.
And the varnish is very discoloured as
Very
well
discoloured.
and creates incredible unevenness across
Yes.
that sky in particular. It's so obvious.
There was sort of syrupy, orangey varnish, especially in the lower portion of the painting. It was apparent that it had had a selective varnish removal.
The previous restorer may have tried to clean and got to that tree area
Yeah.
and realized that there's sensitive paint issue.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with that.
And
That's
they-
definitely happened. We've
Yeah.
got solvent damage up through here, and we've got cotton wool caught up in the varnish here, so they've got into trouble.
We could see that the painting was quite heavily cracked, and when a canvas ages and deteriorates and loses its strength, at some point it ceases to do its job, and its job is to support the paint.
And we took some photos of it under raking light. So you can see all the cracks.
Yeah.
These are mechanical cracks. So from the canvas
Yeah.
expanding and contracting. Relating to patches,
Yes.
these two are most likely done at the same time, which is a later restoration than your early one.
So there were 2 damages in the sky area, 2 little tears, and then there was a much more substantial damage in the foreground. That pointed to it having been restored a few times.
Fascinating. So it's certainly had a life, hasn't it? There's
Had a
no
life,
question.
yes. gone through a lot.
Do we feel it's going to come back? What's going to emerge from the gloom of the mucky varnish, the cracking, the...
Maybe we'll turn it from afternoon back to morning.
Yeah.
Working with Michelle, we came up with a treatment plan to prioritize the stability of the work. Second to that was the aesthetic component of the work. We wanted to make sure that all the failed previous restorations were removed so that we can read Eleanor's work better.
For its age, it presented as really as you would expect it. Something that's sort of almost 140 years old. You've got to expect a few scrapes and dings, I think.
It wasn't only the painting that needed conservation attention when it came in. It had lost its original frame. We imagine it had quite a grand 19th century exhibition frame on it when it was shown in Melbourne, but when I saw it, it had a white strip frame from the late 70s or early 80s. It really did nothing for the painting.
Do you think the work was framed in its time?
It was framed when it was first exhibited, and we're just not 100% sure whether it came out to Australia from France framed or if it was framed here. But there is a work by the artist's husband, Bidjigal Harrison, which we have a photograph of it in 1893 in its frame, and it's remarkably similar to an Australian-made frame.
Which, in my opinion, it was produced in Melbourne. Because it looks exactly like one of the Melbourne's frame maker, John Talon frame.
Yes.
Basha's been at the gallery for 30 odd years, and she has sort of a memory of every frame in the collection, and came upon the Sydney Long, which she thought was a good reference point for this work because stylistically and periodically it was painted in the same era.
They derive from Cassetta Italian frame originally, but of course they are revival frames.
Yes.
But on Australian soil, this kind of frames was very much adopted from 19th century paintings. It follows some rules. So we've got tenia at the top, we've got this nice concave, and also wide frieze, which is very characteristic for Cassetta frames, and also another tenia here, and nicely simple finished with the slip which is inside. So this part made us this lovely, elegant Cassetta frame.
There's multiple purposes of a frame. So a frame protects an artwork by making an enclosure around it. It complements the artwork by adding a decorative touch to it. Traditionally, a gilded frame would help illuminate the artwork pre-electricity.
So the frame has a very important role in also bringing light to the work. It reflects off the surface of the gilding and it glows. And it will hang in our 19th century courts after the exhibition. And that architecture is very strong and very dominant. So paintings have to stand up and own that space as well, and the frames are really important to that. Eleanor grew up in Western Victoria, so she came from quite a successful farming family who seemed to have spent time in Europe when she was a child. So she felt comfortable being in that sphere. And by the early 1880s, when she's studying in France, she meets her husband, Bidjigal Harrison. Well, he's a plein air painter, as is she, and they marry the following year in London. Eleanor is travelling through Europe during this time, so she's immersed in the French and European plein air painting movement, painting outdoors in front of nature. And this is a global phenomenon by the 1880s. A winter morning on the coast of France was certainly conceived on plein air, possibly begun outside, but painted in the studio they built behind their house in the artist colony of Étampes in the 1880s.
Eleanor Ritchie Harrison is one of the first Australian female artists who really embraced being an artist as a profession. You know, this painting, it's an exhibition size scale painting. It was clearly ambitious from the very beginning.
So that's our normal light shot. If we go to the ultraviolet, then we'll be able to say something about the varnish. So it's fluorescing, isn't it? So that's quite a distinctive blue fluorescence, right?
Yeah, whitey blue.
Typically, a natural resin varnish fluoresces a yellowy green colour, and we saw that. And then in the foreground area, it was sort of a little bit bluey, which normally sort of points to a synthetic resin varnish.
So you're thinking that
It's
looks like polyurethane to me.
and on the painting it feels like a urethane because it's really tricky to move.
Right.
You know, it's a floor varnish. It
What
should
would it be
never
doing
be
on
on
a
a
painting?
painting. Yeah.
FTIR is Fourier Transform Infrared. It is a very nifty technology that we can use to analyze binders and sometimes pigments. And it's very helpful for us to know exactly what we're dealing with so that we can target or customize the conservation materials. And I ran the FTIR. It's a really good clear spectrum. And I ran it through the software to get a match against the existing database.
Yep. What's it think?
And yeah, so this
Urethane.
was very good match to polyurethane.
Excellent.
All of them yield polyurethane.
And linseed oil, possibly.
Possibly, yeah, could be a mixture.
Yeah, right.
What we found out through FTIR that it was actually polyurethane. An inappropriate varnish had been put on the painting.
And what's the problem with it on a painting?
Well, it's just so difficult to remove.
Yeah,
It
right.
goes brown and, and
Whereas an artist varnish is easy to dissolve.
easy to
And
dissolve.
you don't have to use a solvent that's going to affect the paint layer.
Yeah, exactly. I've been doing this for 33 years, and it's only been fairly recent in conservation that we've started using gels, which has made this sort of tricky removal possible, which was how we were able to sort of scoop the urethane off and maybe show us that the painting is a little bit more pink than it is today.
For this frame, we chose sustainably sourced jelly-tong from Indonesia. We chose jelly-tong because it is very similar in qualities to a lot of timbers used in Europe at the time. It's very similar to lime wood and fruit woods. It's a hardwood by definition, but it's quite soft. It's easy to shape. It has a fine grain. It doesn't splinter, so it's ideal for the purpose.
We were really keen to what we call consolidate. That actually means make sure that the paint is well adhered to the canvas support to get it structurally stable. You know, when we're anchoring the paint back to the canvas, we used fish glue and swim bladders of the sturgeon fish because it's a nice clear glue, it's got good plasticity.
The jelly-tong we'll put through a mill, planing and thicknessing the timber, and then moving on to shaping it with a router so that we can get the right concave and convex curves. After joining the profile together, it's time to cut the miters, which is quite complex because you want to get the miters very accurate. So there's a lot of lining it up on the saw and making sure everything is very precise.
I set up a little perforated surface that's got a vacuum attached underneath the painting, and I heated up the glue to make it nice and liquid so it would flow nicely over the cracks with this negative pressure underneath. And then we have these really terrific little thermostatically controlled irons to really pull the adhesive through and into the space between the paint and the canvas.
And once the frame is joined, then your first step will be to seal the timber. And we use traditional methods as much as we can. So in this instance, we'll seal the timber with rabbit skin glue or hide glue. Beyond that, we apply gesso, which is a traditional material made of chalk and animal glues. After gessoing, to prepare the surface for oil gilding, we seal it with shellac. And the areas that we're going to water gild, we apply bowl with an airbrush, which is a traditional clay surface mixed with gelatin. Traditionally, you would have done it with a brush, but with an airbrush, it cuts down on the time significantly, and that provides a sort of a cushion for the gilded surfaces that are about to come to the frame.
After it's consolidated, we turn the painting over and remove the patches off the back because it deforms the surface of the painting. If ever you're walking through a gallery and you see painting and there's these sort of little rectangles that look like they're catching the light and they've moved forward a little bit, it's because there's a patch on the back. So obviously We didn't want that to happen to this painting.
Our artists, Eleanor and Burge, are in Etap for 2 years, and at the end of that, we think she was probably feeling a little bit homesick. So in 1889, they come to Melbourne. Eleanor had actually sent paintings back from France during the 1880s, which had been exhibited in Melbourne. And we feel she's come back with her husband Burge to really further the reputation she'd been building. Her work is reviewed as really being an exceptional example of French contemporary painting, and artists are encouraged to see her work to see the latest developments in French art. So I do feel quite strongly she was an inspiration to local artists to actually think beyond their own town, beyond their own circles, and think how they could participate in international art as well.
So we had 2 tears and a hole. We did know the level of damage from the X-rays, especially in the sky area where there's a lot of lead in the paint.
See what we found. The lead layer is obviously very thick, but if there are holes, like a tear or whatever, we'll see it because it's
Let's do the pattern.
going straight through.
The canvas actually on this painting is an unusual weave pattern. It's called a Panama weave, and it's 2 warps and 2 wefts. Normally it's, a plain weave is a single warp and a single weft.
Yeah, and you can see the weave, right? The black dots coming right to about there. And here you can even see, I think you can see the canvas tassels. Can't you see the frayed ends?
Oh, yeah. There's a really lovely technique developed by a German conservator. Essentially, he calls it reweaving a tear. You actually rejoin the threads to its original partner, if you like, where it's been fractured, you actually put it back and reweave it. The damage at the bottom in the foreground area close to the signature, that was actually a hole. So I scavenged a bit of canvas from the back of the painting that had never been part of the composition, and I made a tracing of the hole, the damage, and cut my bit of scavenged fabric roughly to the shape of the damage, but a bit bigger. And then I figured, given that there was paint loss on the front, I flipped the painting back over and I took some really, really thin Japanese tissue mulberry paper, which amazingly strong, and I adhered that to the front over both the insert and also over the canvas where the paint was lost, just to give it a bit of extra stability. I did come back later and put some other single threads which make the painting look like Frankenstein at the back, staggered so that they won't come through and distract visually in the future.
When making reproduction frames at the gallery, we try to follow as many traditional processes as possible, but we're also using modern tools and technologies in the process. There's 2 traditional methods of gilding. One's oil gilding and one's water gilding. For this frame, the majority of it is oil gilded. So the process of oil gilding is to apply an oil size, which often takes between 3 and 12 hours to be ready to apply the gold. It turns to a sort of a tacky surface when it's ready to be gilded. And then the process of gilding is to add the gold leaf straight out of the book onto the artwork. Oil gilding process is quite time sensitive. You need to get the gold onto the surface at the right time. If it's too early, it's too wet, and if you wait too long, the oil size will dry out entirely. And then water gilding. So you reactivate the bowl with water. So you brush on some water and then lay the gold down onto it. And as the gold approaches the surface, it pulls down off your brush. Yeah, it's quite a delicate procedure. You need steady hands, and also it's quite time sensitive if you're going to burnish a surface, because if you start burnishing too early, then you'll start rubbing off the gold, and if you leave it too long to burnish, the gold won't mirror up as you want it to.
We don't have a lot of information about Eleanor as a person, but I feel with the sense of adventurousness, the fact she travelled so much, the fact that she regarded her own practice so highly, the fact she kept her maiden name throughout her exhibiting life as well. So I think we get a sense of her strength, of her commitment to her practice, of her sense of her own professional worth at a time when women really had to fight to establish their own professional reputations. And we have one photograph of her where she's smiling and laughing, which is quite extraordinary. You get a real sense of her vivacity and her personality. It just shines through. We feel that Eleanor and Birch only intended to be in Melbourne for a couple of years. I mean, this has seemed to be how they lived moving around the world. They come to Melbourne, they participate in the art scene by 1891, they've done that, and they move back to America. Birch's health hasn't been great either. He had malaria, so they do move for his health to warmer climes. So off they go to California. In California, Eleanor becomes pregnant. She gave birth to a son in 1895, who they named Linton Robert. Sadly, he died very soon after he was born, and tragically, a week later, Eleanor died as well. She's only 41 at this time. It's also the key to why she then disappears from Australian art history. Only a handful of works stay in Australia. Her death is remarked upon on the newspapers, but soon after, she's forgotten.
When else do you get to be so up close and personal with something that was created by someone with a tremendous amount of talent and really get to see what they did, how they put it together? It's a lot more limited colour palette and I think more sophisticated for it.
So our pigments, so we've got reds, we've got the rose madder and the maybe vermilion, maybe earth reds. We've got the earth colours, which gives us the yellows.
Yeah.
And then blues are maybe cobalt, it looks to me, and then which would be of the period.
What about the green? What do you reckon? We need to spot that, don't we? Where's the...
Yeah, look at that. Oh, beautiful. That's viridian.
Perfect. Yeah.
So that's that nice bottle green that Cezanne always used. So that's 1840. So it's like a modern pigment, but it's in time for this painting.
So we keep our retouchings as minimal as possible, using materials that can be easily removed in the future. And the restoration part is building up the lost paint using what we call infills. Then once the fills are in place, textured, then we start with the retouching colours or the in-painting colours. Retouching is so that when someone's viewing the painting, they're not distracted by the damage. They're looking at the painting as a whole.
Once we've gilded the frame, we're left with a very, very bright gold frame, very bling. So the next step is to patinate it. Patinating is a process of dulling the surface, adding dirt, or trying to replicate a bit of age, trying to give it a bit of history. And the patination allows it to fit in with the rest of the collection in the gallery without standing out. It's a varnish coat that is mixed up with oil paint and various textures that we dab onto the frame and manipulate it around, especially into the cracks or the corners, to sort of sit like it's been in a dusty environment for 100 years perhaps, and make it feel a little bit more like it's had a life, basically.
Once we've done our infills and our in-painting, we're ready to put the final varnish on. It resaturates the surface. It allows you to sort of see, especially into the dark parts of the painting, as the artist wanted them to be. We could really see the painting as a whole was just reading as it should.
Final stage is placing the artwork into the frame, which is exciting. There's a lot of anticipation about whether the frame is going to suit the painting, whether you've matched the atmosphere, or whether it was going to be too strong or too dark or too light. But yeah, it looked good.
Looks incredible. That is absolutely astonishing. Wow. Seeing the completed painting in its new frame was an absolute revelation. To get a sense of how the painting had looked when Eleanor had painted it and when it had been shown in Melbourne in 1890 was extraordinary. It was like being in that moment with the work. Michelle, with the painting conservation, this has come to life.
Yeah, we've got the depth back into the painting, don't we, Wayne? When you've spent 350 hours with a painting, you sort of get a bit of a blindness from too much contact, if that makes sense. So when I saw it in its frame, I was able to see it with fresh eyes.
The frame then is just setting it off perfectly. I mean, it's not been seen like this for probably over 100 years. So how extraordinary.
It's great to see the painting in the frame and that we had complemented it and done it justice.
And I think the idea of the frame being quite simple, but having this heft to it really suits the work because it is a big, ambitious painting. So to have an ambitious frame which presents it like it's in the salon or an academy exhibition works incredibly well.
What I hope people can see is not our handiwork, that you don't see the work of the restorations, but you get to see and enjoy Eleanor's original handwork and brushstrokes.
The auction house who had sold the painting put me in contact with the person who purchased it. He was related to Eleanor Ritchie Harrison's husband, Bidjigal Harrison. When I met the owner, Jamie Hardig, he was incredibly warm and generous, but as we spoke further, he decided to donate it to the Art Gallery of New South Wales.
I'm glad that the Australian public will be able to see it. This is where it belongs.
Showing the newly conserved painting to Jamie was really thrilling. When he had left his house, it had that 130-year history writ large upon it, and now we saw it as Eleanor had intended. It was an incredible moment to share with him. As a curator and art historian, to bring an artist I'd known about, I'd read about, but never seen a painting by, to realise they were absolutely as good as everyone had said in the 1880s, and to be able to bring that to our audiences and show how someone from that period could paint with such ambition, with such bravura and such skill is really an achievement.
Yeah, I think the treatment of this painting is something that I'm going to remember. It was a real privilege, I should say.
Preserving a historically significant work by female artists who would otherwise not be recognised, and also allow future conservators, academics and public to be able to continue to access her work is immeasurable.
And it was incredible to feel that we'd brought this painting back to life as it was about to be shown publicly in an art gallery for the first time in 135 years.